Good morning again, and welcome to Qdabra's weekly webinar. This is Patrick Halstead, and today we have a new technique for you, actually a new webinar, three old techniques or three techniques that we're going to talk about regarding workflow notifications, which is, I think, the number one reason why you do workflow is to use email notifications to let people know their process is underway. I'm very happy today to have Kirby Laborte with me. She is the one that gets the most credit for this webinar. She put the slides together. She's going to be doing the demo. And I want to start off with a quick question to everyone here. We've got actually two questions. First question is, how many of your forms do you have how many of your forms have an email notification? And we'll run this poll very quickly, and hopefully you can see that. Thank you. We've got people responding. I'm just going to give it another few seconds here. It looks like we have a lot of you in the more than 10 bucket. More than half of you are in that bucket. And then everyone else is in the, actually about a third of you are in the less than 5, and 0 of you, actually that's not true. There's one person or two people that are in the 0 bucket. So next question, thank you for answering these questions here. I think I've got this ability to switch to the next poll here. And we're going to go to one more question. What do you use for your email notification today? So for those of you who have email notifications, obviously, SharePoint Designer workflows. This is the previous technique that a lot of people used. Power Automate's the new technique. These are the Microsoft technologies. And I need to launch the poll. So there you go. Sorry about that. And then there may be a few of you using DBXL. I saw some familiar faces. Thank you for being here today. And we're going to talk a little bit about that because we have more customers adopting this, and there's a couple reasons why. And that's really one of the highlights for today. It looks like about 80% of you, 83% are using SharePoint Designer workflows, and a few are using Power Automate. And now that's going up, so maybe more people are answering. Okay, great. Well, thank you for playing the poll game here. That gives us some idea of where you're coming from. Really appreciate that. So for workflow notifications, we're going to talk about these three techniques. And we're going to talk about the first two because those are the defaults. That's what Microsoft recommended SharePoint Designer. They deprecated it in 2014. I don't know if you saw the news on Monday of this week, but they finally discontinued the support for SharePoint Designer-based web form customization. So up until Sunday, I think it was, you could actually change your web page, your form in, you can go into your form in SharePoint, and you could actually point the SharePoint Designer at that form library, and you could customize the form using HTML, using the SharePoint Designer. It's kind of a strange technique. Not very many people use it, but they actually discontinued that. You can still use SharePoint Designer for your workflows, and it is supported until 2026. That's the spring, 6 years from now. Like InfoPath, it was deprecated in 2014, and Microsoft was trying to wrap it up by 2023, but they had to extend it because they shipped it again in 2016, which reset the clock, and then they actually pushed it out a few more months for some other reason, I forget. But right now, the deprecation for the SharePoint Designer, the discontinuation of the SharePoint Designer and the InfoPath Designer is slated for spring, April 1st, 2026. And Power Automate, of course, this is the new approach that Microsoft is pitching. We've been doing tons of Power Automate and Flow workflows, and we think it has a lot of wonderful features. We're going to be talking about that. There are a few things that aren't so wonderful, and we'll be talking about those. And
Patrick, sorry to interrupt. I'm not seeing your screen.
Thank you.
Are you?
How about now?
Yeah, I can see it now.
Okay, I apologize, everyone. Thanks, Kirby, for jumping out. I hope we didn't lose anybody. But yeah, so we're talking about these three techniques today, and I think I should probably go back to the main screen here. So we started off three approaches, and these are the three techniques we talked about. I've been explaining them. So without any further ado, we're going to talk about these techniques, show a couple examples, and then do a demo. So the first example, this should be familiar to everyone, SharePoint Designer workflow. It's very simple to use. It's got a hierarchical indented style when you're creating a workflow, and you can then create an email message. The email message contains these links that you can use, so it's relatively easy to create. SharePoint Designer workflows, the pros are that works today, it's what you're used to, there's no licensing cost. The downside is that it is going away eventually, and notifications are not exactly instantaneous, they are asynchronous, but they're relatively fast. You also can't do more extended things like querying SQL without additional programming. So to set up SharePoint Designer workflows, you just open up SharePoint Designer, you point it at your SharePoint site, and then you go in and you create the workflow. So it's fairly easy to do. We'll show an example in a demo. I just doing a quick overview here of these three different techniques, and then we'll switch to the demo momentarily. So with Flow, you've got a more rich designer. So the designer has this notion of workflow embedded in it. It's more graphical. Obviously, SharePoint Designer had the workflow stuff too, but it was indented style. Now you've got a more graphical Nintex-like designer for the flows, and it's great. You can dive in. It's got a lot of features in it. The downside of Flow, if there is any downside, and you know, we're seeing a lot of Flow adoption, so we recommend Flow. But one thing that we saw recently is that it takes between 3 and 5 minutes sometimes for a flow to arrive. And typically your flows will have other flows. So you might have a multi-flow process. And if you do, because you're doing a good job of designing, in other words, you don't want to have one big sort of monolithic flow because it's hard to maintain, right? You want to break it up into more maintainable small flows. Well, each flow could take up to 5 minutes if you're not on one of these premium plans. So if you're just doing the default free flow plan, the notifications are not instantaneous. And this is how Microsoft is pushing to monetize this new feature, is to get people to upgrade to premium so they can have these two things, the instantaneous flows along with the SQL integration. SQL connection used to be free, and in I think it was October of last year, they designated it now as a premium data connection. So you can't actually connect your flows to SQL today without paying for the premium flow. Easy to set up. Kirby's going to show an example in a second. Now, the third technique, and the one we're going to highlight today as a possible alternative to you, is DBXL. So DBXL is a tool that we built back in 2004. Its main purpose is to integrate your forms with SQL. So if you've got a SQL database, typically if you have a large-scale process where you're collecting thousands and thousands of forms per month, you can't store them all in SharePoint after a few months. SharePoint limitations were about 5,000 items. Now it's greater, but for really a high scale or largely things that you want to scale up quickly, you need some way to store the data that's not SharePoint. And that's why we built DBXL about over 10 years ago, 15 years ago. DBXL, to give you a quick schematic here, it is kind of a connector between your forms and in your database. So if I just show this slide here, this is an old slide, but this kind of gives you an idea of what it's doing. It's allowing you to submit any of your forms to a SQL database and then run reporting or run notifications on them. This is useful because if you don't have this and you're trying to connect to a SQL database, you have to write custom code or you have to create a custom web service, and that can get very expensive. So that's why we built it. And that's what we're going to show in our third part of the demo today. And then we'll come back and talk about the pros and the cons. So with that, Kirby, I'm going to switch to you. And if people have questions, please feel free to throw those questions into the question area. And while Kirby's demoing, I will look at those. Kirby?
Yep. So let me know if you can now see my screen.
Yep.
All right. So here's our expense report form. And before anything else, we'd like to show you the CSS technique that Mel applied in this form. you'll see that the business purpose contains the label within the field. And as soon as we hover over the field, the label floats above the control. I think this is a clever technique to add in your forms as it makes it interactive. So if you want to add this styling in your forms, you can check out our previous webinar where this video right here in our YouTube channel where Kaoru showed the steps on how to implement it using Forms Viewer, since Forms Viewer supports CSS and also JavaScript. So if you know some CSS and JavaScript basics and you have Forms Viewer, you can definitely apply any kind of styling you want to your forms. So going back to our expense report form here, I made myself as both the manager and also the accounting manager so I can receive the emails sent for approvals. So now I'm gonna enter some data here. And just enter.
I thought buffet restaurants were no longer allowed.
Yeah. So I'm just gonna click submit, and in a few seconds now, oh, sorry, I'm not sure why I'm encountering this error, but let me check if the emails, okay, so it's still successful. As you can see, we have here the demo, the SharePoint Designer email, but I'm not sure why we're not receiving the DBXL. So
maybe it's because the submit failed, right? So it didn't go into the DBXL system. So maybe you should just submit it again. Try to open it and submit again.
Sorry about that.
You know it's live when the demo fails.
Yeah. So, oops. I already received the flow email. So I'm going to the debug section and put my name in here. Okay. I'm gonna enter some data again.
You went into the debug section to override the manager, so it was you, right?
Yeah. All right. So as you can see, a PDF file has been generated. Let's see if we can now receive the emails. All right, so as you can see, it's successfully submitted. So we're expecting to see all 3 emails from SharePoint Designer, Flow, and DBXL.
For whatever reason, in our case, the flow email seems to be relatively quickly coming in. It still hasn't come in, it seems, but you see that SharePoint Designer and DBXL emails are very quick, right?
Yeah. So to identify where the email is coming from, we added a prefix in the subject. So as you can see here, we first received the email from SharePoint Designer, next is from DBXL, and last one is from Power Automate or Flow. So as you can see, the emails all have the same content. One difference we can see here among the 3 is that the email triggered in the SharePoint Designer has the demo as the sender. So demo is the site where our form library is located, and SharePoint Designer will always show the name of your site as the sender name. It seems that there's no way that we could customize the sender address in SharePoint Designer, unlike in Flow and in DBXL. So here's what our workflow looks like in SharePoint Designer. So I've added the send an email action for each form status. And I've also set up the messages and the fields to retrieve the data from. So as I've mentioned earlier, there's no way to configure the from address in SharePoint Designer email message, as you can see here in this screen. So now I'm going to show you how our email setup looks like in Flow. Okay, so here we have the expense report notifications demo flow. And when I click edit, it will show us the our flow. So here, when we expand this action and click the send email, it's going to show us the content of our email. So I'm using the SMTP action for sending the emails, but it's not the only action available for sending emails in Flow. You can check the other options by adding an action. So let's add an action here, sample action, and type in email. And Flow will show you all the possible actions that you could use. So here we have the Outlook, we also have Gmail and the others. So one advantage I noticed when using the SMTP action is that you can specify the sender address. Even if it's a non-existent email address, the sending of email will still work. So as you can see, we've specified the notifications at formsboard.com.
Quick question on the other email options. Is the body still this HTML? Is it still as bad in the other options, or is it more WYSIWYG?
Well, it depends on the action. Like I guess there are other email actions that doesn't support HTML. So if we go to the advanced options here, you're going to see that there's a field called is HTML. So if it's, yeah, in other email actions,
if you go to like the default mail one down below there, if you like that, then does it give you a better user interface to edit the email body?
Yeah, there's other, yeah, other
it's rich text.
It
looks like it's rich text. Yeah. It doesn't support HTML, or does it?
Yeah, for this email action, there's no, it doesn't support HTML.
Okay. I thought it would.
All right.
Thanks.
So the last email setup I'm going to show you is in DBXL. So here we have created a document type called expense report demo. So this is where the expense report documents or XMLs are being submitted. As you can see in the documents tab, I've just submitted a bunch of expense report forms here. And here you'll see an email tab. So this is where we configure the email mappings. So basically, DBXL shows a view in your form as the body content of the email. And in this page, we can specify that view. So here we specified email as the form view that we're going to use. And we can also specify other email values like the sender and the receiver address. And you can also specify values for the CC and VCC addresses. So here in the form, in our expense report demo opened in the InfoPath Designer, we have here a view called email. And this is what this view looks like. And so here I've added a bunch of sections that contains the messages and also the links that we'd like to show in our emails. And I'm just basically showing each by adding a formatting rule to hide the others based on the status field value. So for example, this section here, I have here a formatting rule to only show it when status is equal to submitted. So this section is for sending to the manager. And I also have here another section that I wanted to show only, I wanted to show in the email body regardless of the status value. So there's no formatting rule added in here. So once those are all set up, you can achieve these emails as notifications for your forms, whether it's for approvals or just a plain notification when something has changed or to ask users to do a specific action.
That's great. And like the SharePoint Designer workflow, or the designer, when you can edit the email notification, with the last technique, the DBXL technique, you can edit it in the WYSIWYG editor and InfoPath Designer, so it makes it a little bit easier to create, right? Because it's HTML by default. Right? Okay. Thank you, Kirby. Thank you so much for that quick demo. If anyone has questions, please go ahead and ask them. I'm going to go back to my screen and just quickly summarize once again the pros and the cons of DBXL. So you may be assuming that flow is the right way forward. That's cool. I just want, we've had customers point out that the licensing costs for flow, with the instantaneous emails and things like that, maybe more egregious. What's the right word? That the licensing cost and the fact that the flows are not instantaneous and the flows require these premium connectors has been a challenge for some of our customers. Now, it's a user-based licensing model. Qdabra DBXL, we provide a free trial. The licensing cost is a fixed small amount that you pay a year. It includes support. So it's not, it makes sense if you've got a lot of flows and you're trying to do something very quickly and you don't want to pay like a non-linear or linear scaling cost. But this is fixed, so it's not going to scale as much in terms of the cost as flow would for those two ideas, or those two issues, the instantaneous notifications and the fact that you can't connect to SQL. So that's really the purpose of this webinar. I wanted to quickly, it's easy to set up. Obviously, we're providing a free trial. We will be happy to help you install DBXL. It's much more than just email notifications. Obviously, you can map your data to SQL, which means that you can then, all of your repeating data can be mapped into SQL. And that's great for other processes. If you want to move off of InfoPath and take the data out of your forms, DBXL would be one great way to do that, because you can extract all the data into SQL and then have those other processes like Power Apps, access SQL. You can also use the SQL data to do, things like Power BI reporting and more scalable reporting. It's also much, much faster to query SQL and to submit to SQL than it is to query SharePoint lists and libraries and submit to those. So the performance is huge. So there's some benefits to using DBXL. We've got hundreds of customers on it. Thanks, Richard, for your first question here. The question is, are flow costs included if you are paying Office 365 subscription? Yeah, you do get a free flow license with your 365. I think it's an E3 licensing. Depending on your SKU, there's lots of different licensing options, but most of them will have a free flow in them. They're enterprise licenses. So that enterprise licenses gives you the default, which doesn't include instantaneous notifications, and that's mainly an issue when you have lots of different notifications one after the other, because each one's going to be delayed, and then it kind of it becomes an issue. With our email notification today, you saw that it only took a minute or two. Microsoft says up to 5 minutes, I think, or maybe it's, I don't know, 3 minutes, I forget. It's between 3 and 5 minutes per notification, and that can be an issue when you have lots of flows together, which you normally would have. And the other issue is that they have recently removed some of these premium data they've recently removed data connectors and made them more premium, and if you don't have the premium SKU, then you can't get them. So they're really trying to monetize it, and that's what Microsoft does, but they may be changing the playing field again in the future. We don't know, but because of the changes last October, we got quite a few customers contacting us asking if there's other approaches, and that's where we started implementing this DBXL approach for a handful of customers. And so hopefully I was able to answer your question. But yeah, Flow is free. There is a default license there, but it doesn't include those quick email notifications, nor does it include the premium data connectors. So that's the question. I guess we don't have any other questions, but I want to thank you all for being here today. We are continuing to innovate new features, new UI in Forms Viewer. In fact, we have another demo coming, not next week, but the following week. We're going to take a break next week. We've been doing webinars for most of April. And then we'll come back, I think, the second week in May, and we'll show a technique for the, in fact, let me just quickly preview it. I think, Kirby, do you have the link to the task pane stuff that Joanne did, that Joanne prepared with the dynamic flyout? Do you have that?
I don't have it right now.
Okay. Let me just quickly get it on my screen here. I need to open up Outlook because I forget where the link is. And so while I'm doing that, if you have any other questions, please ask them. We are committed to getting the Forms Designer done, and we're trying to get that done this year. Obviously, there's a lot of work to do there, but we've made a lot of progress, and we hope to have that out. You're still going to be able to use the InfoPath Designer for a few more years, so don't worry too much about that. I'm just going to find this link here, and appreciate your patience. Do a quick preview of this technique then, if I can find the link. Okay, I think I found it. I have another question too, or another chat. Okay, so I'm going to share out my screen again. So this is the demo that Joanne prepared. We've been doing a lot of really crazy stuff with CSS, and this is the sample form that she's going to talk about in a couple weeks. You saw task panes a few weeks ago. What you didn't see is this this task pane that flies out like this. And I want to thank Shane Harvey for the inspiration behind this. But this is all no code. I don't think it's any code. Maybe it is. Maybe there's a little bit of JavaScript, but very easy to add this to your forms, and you can have different views, different sections that come up, and so on. So we'll be talking about that technique and how to add it to your forms in a couple weeks. We really appreciate you being here in these webinars, and if you've got any questions whatsoever, feel free to send us an email. We got a short survey, a couple questions at the end, and then we'll send you the samples that we demoed today, the expense report form with the floating label stuff in it. We've also done a webinar a couple weeks ago on the floating labels. Actually, it was last week. So if you go up to YouTube, you can actually watch that. That's the link that it's a wisteria, the flower. We're always using these colorful seasonal themes. Yeah, and that's what we did last week with Kirby and Joanne. And you can actually download the samples. There's a link here to download them, and it might be easier to use those samples to do the floating label technique than the expense report form, but we'll include that as well with the package after you fill out the survey. Thank you very much for being here. Really appreciate you as a customer and watcher of these webinars. We will be back in a couple weeks. Have a great day.